Good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. William Simpson. Bill is originally from Bethesda, Maryland, but came to Alaska in 1997. He is a professor of chemistry at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry within the College of Natural Science and Mathematics, and he also is with the Geophysical Institute. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry from Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania and his PhD in Physical Chemistry from Stanford University in California. In addition to his duties at UAF, Bill recently served on the Fairbanks Air Quality Stakeholders Group as a science representative. He specializes in studying atmospheric chemistry and pollution, which is what he is here to talk to you about tonight. Bill?
Thank you. Thank you. So thanks very much. Can everybody hear me? So thanks very much for the very nice introduction there. And what I'd like to tell you about today is particulate pollution in Fairbanks, Alaska. We'll see if this is working. It is on. Maybe rebooting it? Okay, good. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is the science of smoke, Fairbanks's particulate pollution problem. And this is a place I live, this is a place I love to live, and it is a place that has beautiful springtime weather, like this kind of weather, where you get clear skies, lots of sun, and often that causes cooling at the ground level and strong inversions. And that type of situation can lead to smoke trapped near the ground like this. And we want to understand what's in that smoke and the sources of that smoke in order to be able to have good breathable air for us here in Fairbanks.
Can you identify, before you go, where the smoke is coming from? That's such a
So this picture was taken from, I think it's a DEC picture. Sorry about the mouse. It's taken from Chino Ridge, I think, and then you're looking at kind of treetop level pollution, which is, as we'll be talking about, from mostly ground level sources. And then you can see some power plants, and I'll be talking about both of those in the talk. Okay, so just a little bit about air quality and about the Clean Air Act. When I was a kid, I went to visit my grandparents in Detroit, and we spent a night in Gary, Indiana. And I really remember that night because it just smelled so bad. I mean, it just was all around there, lots and lots of pollution in that area. And the Clean Air Act has really made these type of scenes in the US much less common. The Clean Air Act has led to a great reduction in many of the pollutants that were targeted by the Clean Air Act, and has cleaned up many of these situations. It's done a particularly good job at industrial pollutants because it's something that you can measure and you can target and you can reduce those things. Okay, so the reason that we care about pollution is because particles can cause harm to your health. So as Fritz said, I'm not going to really be talking about health, but that is our motivation here. So I wanted to give a plug for a talk by Dr. Owen Hanley, which is called What You Breathe Matters, Here's Why, and it's on YouTube, so you can go and take a look at that. This talk is specifically about the health effects of particles, and that's something that is motivating the work that we have right here. I think most people know that Fairbanks has one of the worst air qualities in the United States. So this is from the American Lung Association, and it's a report called The State of the Air in 2018. And they looked at air pollution at various locations around the United States, and specifically looked at pollution by different pollutants. Ozone, we're not on that list. Year-round particle pollution, at which point Fairbanks is #1 on the list, the worst polluted place in the United States. And then short-term particle pollution, we're #4 on the list. So the pollution here in Fairbanks is really quite bad and puts us on the top of this list for particulate pollution. Okay, what am I talking about when I'm talking about particulate pollution? What I'm talking about is small particles that you breathe in, and when you breathe them in, they put chemicals into your lungs and they can cause health effects. When you talk about the particles that we're interested in, we call them fine particulate matter, or fine particulates. We also call it PM 2.5, because the ones that we're interested in are less than 2.5 microns in diameter. So they're very small particles. For scale, you can see here a human hair, which is 70 microns across, and this is the cross section of that human hair, and then this is a PM 2.5 particle compared to the hair. So they're very small. And since they're so small, they can get deep into your lungs. Our breathing apparatus is built to keep out particles, and so the bigger particles get stuck up in here, the nose and mouth and throat, and then eventually you can expel that out. But the smaller particulate matter, like PM 2.5, can make it deep into your lungs where it can then deliver chemicals to cause health harm. So because of this realization that this fine particulate matter was particularly correlated with health, there were studies done by the EPA, and really an EPA panel met to review studies, and that panel selected the concentration of 35 micrograms per cubic meter as the threshold at which point we would call air clean, or if it was above that threshold, say that that air is unhealthy. So this is a number to keep in mind. 35 micrograms per cubic meter is the regulatory level, and it's based on health studies. Maybe it's too far away. Okay. So the way we sample this and measure that concentration is, imagine we have a cubic meter of air. Then we're going to take that cubic meter of air and draw it through a filter called a cyclone. This is like a Dyson vacuum cleaner if you have one. So it separates out larger particles which fall out of this, and the smaller particles, less than 2.5 microns, so this is kind of acting like your nose, end up getting through that. And then those small particles are taken onto a filter. This is a picture of the filter media, and it's just a little 2-inch disc that the particles are going to stick to. And we draw the particles onto that filter. And we're then going to measure the mass of the filter before we sample it and after we sample it. And by the difference, we get the mass of the particles that have been brought onto that filter. And let's say we got a mass of 35 micrograms. And then we divide by the volume of air that we measured in, and say a cubic meter, and then you'd have a mass concentration of 35 micrograms per cubic meter. And in fact, this thing right here is one of those samplers. So this sampler has the inlets right here, and then those tubes go to a pump, which I haven't brought in because it's actually quite heavy. Why does Fairbanks have this problem? Why do we have this pollution when we live in a place that's not very highly populated? And there's really two things that are contributing to this especially. One of them is that we get these really strong temperature inversions that trap pollution near the ground. So I think we're all familiar with the open-topped freezers at a grocery store where the freezer is open and the cold air stays mostly in the freezer because cold air is denser than warm air. So we get that situation in Fairbanks where a meteorological inversion sets up and traps pollutants down near the ground. The other thing we have is large sources of pollutants. So heating, driving, power generation, all these things emit particles. And when it emits those particles and they get trapped in this inversion, they can build up to high levels above that 35 micrograms per cubic meter and can cause us air quality problems down for people at the ground. The bad days that are bad air days have three things really to go for them. One is that they're cold, leading to large sources, often causing large inversions. Second, that they're inverted. They have strong temperature inversions which trap the pollution near the ground. And third, they have calm winds, because if there's some wind, you can push out the pollution. So those are the three things that lead to this problem meteorologically. And then the sources are the thing that builds up the pollution in this situation. Okay, so some people say Fairbanks has some of the strongest inversions in the world, and that's true. Fairbanks has incredibly strong meteorological inversions compared to what you see in many other places around the world. And some people say, well, how can we solve this air quality problem in the face of really difficult meteorological conditions? And what I want to show you that says that we can solve that problem is data from carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is another pollutant that's regulated under the Clean Air Act, and we used to violate the the CO standard, the carbon monoxide standard, back in the late 90s. And before that, I think many people in the audience probably remember that time when we had CO problems. Well, what's happened subsequent to that is that CO has come down and down and down, and it's like a factor of 2 or 3 below the regulatory level right now. So we have solved a problem which has to do with injecting pollution underneath a strongly inverted situation. So I think this points out that we can solve problems like this. In this case, it was because cars got a lot better and onboard diagnostics tell you when you need to get your car fixed. You know, if I open the hood of my car, I look in there, I can't even stick my hand in, you know, so how am I going to fix anything? It tells me I need to get it fixed, and that fixes the emission system and brings down carbon monoxide. Okay, so this is now switching to particulate matter, PM 2.5, and looking at the concentrations of PM 2.5 around the area. And this is kind of a busy slide, but I wanted to keep this with the presentation which is on the DEC website. So you can go to this link and find the same information, and it keeps getting updated as there's new data each year. So these are showing PM 2.5 annual data in mass concentration here. And initially the monitoring was done at the Fairbanks sites. These were actually sites in the downtown area that were put in for the carbon monoxide problem. And in the Fairbanks area, what we see are levels around here. And we came into violation when the panel at EPA met and lowered the 24-hour standard from 65 micrograms per cubic meter down to 35, the current standard micrograms per cubic meter. And that happened in 2006, again based on health data that they got from epidemiological studies. They decided that that was the right regulatory level. And we came into non-compliance at that point. What then really happened that kicked it up was heating oil prices spiked in about 2008. And when the heating oil prices went up, it ended up that people switched over to other sources of heat, and specifically largely to wood at that time. And probably some of the people who were burning wood at that time were burning greener wood or things like that, which tends to make more particulate matter. So this spiked up the PM 2.5 in Fairbanks, and actually subsequent to that, it's come back down. So Fairbanks has improved its PM 2.5 concentrations after that spike, which happened with the heating oil prices. We also at that time started looking at a residential neighborhood in North Pole, and so looking at data in North Pole, Alaska, and the levels were much higher in North Pole. Those levels were up here, and they've decreased by about a factor of 2. So a lot of progress has been made, and kudos to North Pole for really bringing down these particle levels. So it's gotten better. It's still not down to the regulatory level, as you can see right here. So there's still a ways to go. What has been done to try and deal with that situation? So the borough and the state have been proactive on trying to work on this situation, and one of the key things that has been done is that burning dry wood really helps to reduce particulate pollution. It also gets you more heat into your house, because if you're burning wet wood, you're boiling the water out of that wood, and it takes a lot of energy to do that. So burning dry wood puts out less particles, so there's this split, stack, store, and save program, which is trying to help people to know that it's a good thing to burn dry wood. And that's probably done some of the help to reduce the PM 2.5 levels. Another thing is there's been an active wood stove changeout program to cleaner wood stoves or to alternative heating devices which have less emissions, as I'll show in a little bit. There have been burn bans on selected days, and I'll address that in one of the questions that I want to address here. And then a thing I really want to point out is weatherization and insulation of houses. You know, the least emitting heat you can put into your house is heat that you don't lose out of your house. If you insulate your house more and don't need as much heating, then you put out less pollution. So that's another way to decrease the pollution. And these things have been done and have brought down the particulate levels. So I have 4 questions that I want to address today in this talk. First of them is, how do we know wood smoke is a major source? Second, what about power plant emissions? You can see them, and how much of the problem is power plant emissions. Third is, do burn bans work? And then 4, why we might want to consider reducing the sulfur in the fuel oil that we have. Okay, so into the first question, how do we know wood smoke is a major source? So first off, you can see a monitoring site here, which looks a lot like this one right here. It's the same model as this one. So this monitoring site is a place where we're going to measure the air quality. And we're going to sample particles at ground level, because that's where people are breathing. And these studies we often call receptor studies, because that's a receptor location where the pollution comes to, and we can measure the chemicals in that pollution to tell where the pollution came from. And really, when you analyze these filters, what you find are 3 major components that are in the particles. The first component is organic compounds, which will be sometimes called OCM in slides that I have later. Those organic compounds can be all kinds of things that have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You know, they can be things like a molecule called levoglucosan, which is produced from wood combustion. They can be compounds like polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are often coming from fossil fuel sources. So lots of things can contribute to this class, organic compounds. And that's one of the biggest things in particles in Fairbanks. Second is ammonium sulfate. This largely comes from sulfur that is in heating oil. It can also come from sulfur that is in coal. So these are sulfur that then gets converted either in the combustion process or subsequently in the atmosphere to form ammonium sulfate. And that's another constituent of these particles. The third big one is elemental carbon, just black carbon soot. And if you see like a diesel that's producing a lot of emissions, just a black cloud, that's essentially this elemental carbon right here. So these are the 3 things that we typically see in the particles. So what I like to think about to try and figure out how to parse that out is an analogy. And this analogy that I want to walk you through here is thinking about another thing that has 3 main constituents in it, food. So if you think about food, food has fat, carbs, and protein. That's what you find on the back of the food label, fat, carbohydrate, and protein. And different sources of food that, say, my daughters might eat might be some of these things right here. And each of those foods has a different mix of those 3 things. So if you eat marshmallows, you're getting 100% carbohydrate. There's nothing else in that but sugar. If you're eating nuts, you've got fat, you've got carbohydrate, and actually a lot of protein compared to these others. And if you're eating the donut, you're eating 45% fat, 50% carbohydrate, and 5% protein. So if I analyzed one of my daughter's foods, what they ate, and I found that my younger daughter had a 100% carbohydrate diet, I think I would know that she only was eating marshmallows, because that's the only solution that has 100% carbohydrate. If she ate anything else, she'd have the other things also in her food intake. If I looked at my older daughter's food combustion, maybe I might find that there's 10% protein or something like that, and I'd know, hey, she's got to be at least eating some nuts, because if she was eating even just straight donuts, she wouldn't be able to get up to 10% protein. So from an analysis of the receptor, the person who is eating or the person is breathing, we can analyze what's in the air that they're breathing and what's in those particles. And if I know the source profiles, I can match it up. Okay, so the way I want to do this is, as humans, we can see 3 colors. So the 3 colors we see are red, green, and blue, and that projector is putting out those 3 colors, red, green, and blue. And I'm going to take the composition of a particle, and I'm going to map it onto a color by making the amount of red related to the amount of organic compounds, the amount of blue related to the sulfate, the ammonium sulfate, and the amount of green coming from the elemental carbon. And I get a color. So this color here is a mix, and I think you can see it's got a lot of organic carbon in it because it's kind of close to that red right there. So what I want to do is a little poll here. So I've got some sources here. These are different sources in this area. And then I've got an observed composition over here. And so I want to do a poll by hands. Who thinks this color looks most like D, like source D? So we got one who thinks it looks like D. I apologize here if anyone's red, green, or colorblind. This is going to be a little hard for some people. So I saw a couple of hands for D. How about C? How about B? A few B. And how about A? Who thinks it looks most like A? And so we see lots of people seeing it most like A. Well, let's see what the answer is. A is wood. That's wood smoke. That is the composition of wood smoke mapped onto these colors. And this site is the North Pole receptor site. So we're looking at the composition at North Pole, and it's very close to the composition of wood smoke. It does have a mixture. There is some mixture of these other components in it. And I can also look at downtown Fairbanks. Downtown Fairbanks has less heating by wood, and you can see the downtown Fairbanks color here. It's definitely not as red. It's not purely wood. It probably has more oil combustion in it. So this concept is called source apportionment, and we can do this by eye, and you can kind of get a picture of what's going on, but you can also do this mathematically, and we call that procedure chemical mass balance modeling. We mix together the sources, and then we predict the composition based upon how much of each of these sources are contributing. And this really measures the contributions to breathing level air quality, because we put the sensor down at the ground where people are breathing. So the result of that is this table, and these are published work, so peer-reviewed scientific publications like Tony Ward's paper in 2012, which used this chemical mass balance modeling approach to look at the composition in Fairbanks and look at the percentage of the particles that are coming from wood, and found 63% of the particles were coming from wood in Fairbanks, and 80% of the particles were coming from wood in North Pole. So a dominance at North Pole of wood, and still more than half by that analysis of wood in Fairbanks. That was redone with a new set of profiles that were maybe a little bit more appropriate to Fairbanks, because they were Fairbanks fuels that were burned in tests. And that got a smaller number, 38%, 70%, also done by Tony Ward. And so we see, in general, these numbers bounce around a little bit, but that's because we're slightly changing the mathematics that we're doing there. What I take from this is all these numbers are pretty much half in Fairbanks and something like 3/4 in the North Pole mixture in terms of wood contribution. I'll tell you quickly about these other methods. Positive matrix factorization is a way to get at this from the data. So you use a mathematical method to look at correlations between the species in the particles, and then you can get estimates there. You could do it by other methods too, and they're all generally consistent with something like half in Fairbanks and something like 3/4 of the particles in North Pole. So wood is the biggest contributor, and it's always the leading contributor, the biggest single contributor in all those studies. So you might ask, how is that? You know, you probably have a wood stove. Many people do. I do. You know, many people also have an oil boiler to have heat. So there was a survey done to look at how much heat comes from different sources in different places around the area. And so this telephone survey asked people how much wood they burn, how much oil they burn. And in downtown Fairbanks, the percentage of heat coming from wood was 12%, and the majority of the heat was coming from oil. Something like 83% of the heat was coming from oil in downtown Fairbanks. In North Pole, 99705 zip code, there is a higher percentage of wood combustion, but still a dominance of oil. Oil is the biggest heat source in both of those areas. So the only way that works out to have wood dominate the particles and yet not be the leading source of heat is if wood puts out more particles per heat. And that is in fact the case. So we can look at these emissions per unit of heat. So this chart shows data. I've got the references over on the right-hand side there, and we can probably put them in the comments of the YouTube if you're looking at the YouTube video. This shows the emission per unit heat in milligrams of PM 2.5 per megajoule. A megajoule is about 1,000 BTUs if you work in that unit. And you can see in this scale that a wood stove has a broad range. It can be pretty clean, 20 milligrams per megajoule, up to more than 1,000 milligrams per megajoule. It can have such a large range because of burning practices. If somebody's burning wet wood, they'll put out a lot more particles. If it's a bad stove, it would put out a lot more particles. If it was an open fireplace, that has a low efficiency of getting heat into the house, so you get a high emissions from it. So you get a range here. And if you have a more engineered solution like a pellet stove, then they can be a bit cleaner, but they have a narrower range because it's a more engineered system, and that's the range 10 to 50 according to this citation right here. In order to make that real, I took some wood stoves that are the types that you can buy here in Fairbanks. I didn't want to mention the specific wood stove they are, but this one's a 2.4 gram per hour wood stove, and I divided by the amount of heat it puts out, and you get this number, 127. So that's an EPA certified wood stove, and it's still putting out a decently high number of PM 2.5 per amount of heat that's coming out. A cleaner wood stove at 0.9 grams per hour is down here. A pellet stove is still a little bit lower. If you look at an oil boiler, it's still lower than that. So this is from an East Coast study looking at an oil boiler running on number 2 fuel. And they found a number of 1.3 on this same scale. So it's an order of magnitude, a factor of 10 less emissions than these relatively clean EPA certified wood stoves. So it's really important to remember that even a well-operating wood stove still does put out more particles per heat than do other cleaner sources of heat, such as oil or ultra-low sulfur diesel on a boiler and natural gas. Let's see, maybe I have to walk over here. Hello?
Wood stove, do you know if that had a catalyst on it?
Gosh, I think they were both catalytic wood stoves. Yes, I think they were. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is the power plant contribution to ground level air quality. So remember, this is our picture here. We see this pollution down at treetop level, very close to the ground, and then we see these power plant plumes popping up, either because there's a high stack or because that stack is coming out at high temperature and it rises up before it gets pushed over by the winds. So the power plants contribute to this problem, but some of their emissions go up high. And so we want to think about that, because that stuff that goes up doesn't necessarily impact the ground. So sometimes people think of this like Vegas. What happens in the boundary layer down near the ground stays in the ground, stays down near the ground. Well, the stuff that's emitted higher up might come back down, but it might not. It might catch a wind out there and it might go away. So let's look at the power plant contribution, and the way that we're going to look at this is from a thing called an emissions inventory. This is the way you add up the emissions based upon who's putting particles into the area, based upon how much fuel they're burning, and emission ratios like I showed earlier. So according to the state implementation plan modeling, what you see is that something like 60% of the particles that are coming into this area are coming from area sources, wood and oil, domestic heating. Only a quarter of it's coming from power plants. And then the other ones here are adding up to an even smaller, something like 15%. So this is adding up from the bottom up, and it's not taking into account the fact that some of those power plant emissions are being injected into higher layers. So even if we just take the kind of worst case scenario for the maximum impact of power plants, we find that it's a quarter. If we look at it in terms of emission into various layers, the way the modeling is done, they look at a lowest layer from 0 to 40 meters or 130 feet above ground level. And it turns out it's about an eighth or 13% of the PM that's being emitted. is emitted in the lowest layer by the point sources. About half of the point source emission comes out higher. This 12% is put into higher layers. Some of this 12% might come back and affect the ground, but we can kind of get a bounds on this, that it's something between maybe 13% and something like 25% is coming from these power plants. So they're smaller than home heating, and they're smaller than the wood smoke contributions that we looked at earlier. So although it's a part of the problem and it's something we should probably be addressing at some stage, I think that the strategy of trying to address wood smoke first is the correct strategy that was taken in this situation. The next question I want to deal with is the question of, are burn bans effective? So recently, there's started to have been burn bans where the state now, and it used to be the borough, predicted the days which are going to have the worst trapping conditions. And the typical prediction is something like 20 to 30 days of the winter where you have this combination of cold temperatures, strong inversion, and no wind. And on those days, they say that if you have another source of heat, you have to use that other source of heat other than wood stoves. Of course, there is a way that if somebody doesn't have another source of heat, they can apply for a so-called no-ash permit, which is a no other adequate source of heat permit, which then allows you to heat your house if you need to on those days because you don't have another source or you don't have an economic ability to use your other source. So you can apply for that permit and then the burn bans don't apply to you. Having said that, most people don't have one of those permits. So generally when there's burn bans on, people shouldn't be burning in the non-attainment area. So what we'd like to know is this effective? This is very obtrusive. This is not something anyone would like to do, but is it effective? Is it something that's going to help clean up the air? So we wanted to look at this. What you'd really like to do is know the ratio of the pollution you see divided by the pollution that would have been there if you didn't call the burn ban. But you can't know that number because you did call the burn ban. So we have to look for some other ratio to see whether this is an effective strategy or not. And the way we explored this is to look at the ratio of sulfate to PM 2.5. So this is the ratio of the amount of sulfate in the particles divided by the total mass concentration of the particles. And that's a percentage. And in the Fairbanks area, this is data from Fairbanks from the last winter, November 2017 to February 2018. The typical number we see in Fairbanks is that 18% of the particulate mass is made up of this sulfate, and most of the sulfate is coming from sulfur in the heating oil. So if we think about if you were to call a burn ban, what should happen is the PM 2.5 concentration should come down because you're switching from a wood smoke source, which produces more PM per heat, to a lower PM per heat emitter. So PM 2.5 should go down. That's your intended thing. You may also have a slight increase in the amount of sulfate because now more people are burning the fuel that produces the sulfate. So what you'd expect if the burn bans are effective and that people are complying with the burn bans is that this ratio should go up. And in fact, it does go up. So if we start from the no curtailment, 18% value, which is also the historical value for the last like 10 years, then you go to stage 1 curtailment and it went up to 23%. And then if you go to a stage 2 curtailment where only people with a no ash permit are allowed to burn, it goes up to 26%. So what we see is a change in the composition of the particles, which is consistent with people complying with the burn bans. So that's nice. And what it's really doing is it's decreasing the denominator. It's decreasing the PM 2.5 to make this ratio go up. So looks like we have data that says the burn bans are effective. The thing about this is that we don't know how many people are complying. We don't know the actual compliance ratio. We're trying to think of ways to get that from this, but this is just saying there is a change in composition due to this, not a specific quantification of how many people complied with the burn ban. Okay, the last thing I wanted to say on this is this points out that as we control wood smoke better and bring down the wood smoke PM, the amount of PM that's coming from the sulfur in the fuels, which leads to this sulfate, is going up. So at some point, we're going to want to consider what we can do to bring down the sulfate in the fuel. And there's something you can do that, which is to have less sulfur in the fuel oil which you burn. So there was a study on the East Coast from Brookhaven National Lab which looked at the amount of PM coming out from a cast iron boiler. This is the same boiler that I have in my basement, actually. So it's a standard boiler, Whale McLean boiler around here. And you can see with more sulfur in the fuel, you see more PM coming out. And then as you lower the sulfur in the fuel, it's essentially a linear decrease in the amount of particles that are coming out. So you can clean up the sulfate particles and decrease the air pollution by going to a lower sulfur content in the fuel oil. The East Coast, based upon this, decided to mandate the use of ultra-low sulfur diesel, 15 ppm or less right here. So they went to this endpoint right here. We don't have a local source of ultra-low sulfur diesel, so the cost is a lot higher for ultra-low sulfur diesel for us. But we do have the ability to switch from, say, number 2 heating oil, which is about 2,000 parts per million, down to number 1, which has less than half that content of sulfur at 900 ppm. So it is a thing you can do to switch to a lower sulfur heating oil, and that can help to reduce the particles that are in the air. So overall, in conclusion, what I want to point to is there's multiple lines of peer-reviewed publications which have indicated that the major source of the particle pollution in this area in Fairbanks, but particularly in North Pole, is wood smoke. So there's lots of evidence for that, and I showed you a little bit of that, and you guys picked it that that was the best match, that wood smoke was the best match. So that's an important thing to remember. Second of all, that power plants do contribute, but they contribute less than wood smoke. So it's something that we want to be thinking of, but it's not something that is going to directly solve the problem at this stage. The third one is that burn bans are effective at reducing PM 2.5. We see direct evidence of that. And I think this points out that individual choice to comply with the burn ban is something that can change the air quality out there. And so individual choices, talking about this with neighbors and telling them what we know is very important to bring down PM 2.5 concentrations. The last one is we might consider reducing sulfur in fuel oil. Sorry about that. The last one is we might consider reducing sulfur in fuel oil by, say, switching to number 1 to affordably reduce some of the PM 2.5 sulfate. Again, that won't in and of itself solve the problem, but it goes in the right direction. So I'd like to acknowledge people who've helped me on this. Certainly the university, the Geophysical Institute, colleagues that I've worked with have been really important to me, and students in contributing to this work, and I wanted to acknowledge their efforts. I really wanted to acknowledge the borough, the DEC, the EPA, colleagues from other academic institutions for these excellent measurements. This really builds upon work that has been done by colleagues, and it uses EPA data that we're using here that was taken by the borough. So I'd really like to thank them. National Science Foundation funded a workshop that we held here in Fairbanks that got us a lot of information on this too. And then last, I really wanted to thank all of you for coming, because you're learning about this. You may know about this situation already, but I think Fairbanks residents have a lot of clever ideas on how to solve these things and understand this situation. And I really like working with people to try and solve this problem. And I'd definitely like to hear any ideas you have in both the questions, and then at the last slide, I'm going to have my email. So please, if you have any questions, I'd like to make myself available. So.
Thank you, Bill.